Welcome back. I hope everybody enjoyed the morning breakout sessions, and I hope everybody had a nice lunch break. For this afternoon's general session, Dr. Brock will continue speaking about moral injury. Dr. Buchner will join her to facilitate audience questions. During Dr. Brock's presentation, audience questions can be submitted through the chat button at the bottom of your toolbar. Dr. Brock, again, thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be back. So I hope everyone's had maybe a cup of coffee or some tea if lunch makes you drowsy. It's always a challenge to speak after everybody's had a meal, but I don't plan to talk as long this time. So I hope you can stay with it. I'm gonna share my screen again. Good. So this half of my talk is now that we have a grasp of how comprehensive and complex moral injury can be. I'm going to talk a little bit about recovery. What are some of the strategies that we can use to help with recovery? And to do that, I'm going to use the template of a particular program that we developed at Volunteers of America that is a multidimensional program. So it sort of goes after some of those habits, rituals, meaning systems that I talked about this morning. It's actually a program that Herm Kaiser and I began to work on when he and I had co-founded the Soul Repair Center, and we were also struggling with, well, now what do you do about it? And of course, he had stories himself from being in Vietnam and doing something that he just tried something that he thought would be helpful, and it turns out that he had good instincts, as it were, how to care for people's souls. And he told the story once of he had been in Vietnam with his unit for maybe 2 weeks, and as we learned this morning, he didn't stay in the back safe areas. He actually moved with his units to places on front lines, which is how he wound up wounded twice. But in this case, he'd just been in Vietnam a couple of weeks, and his unit was loading into trucks to stage to move to another area. And so he decided, well, he was a chaplain, maybe he could do something. So he walked up to the first truck in the line, and they were all, sort of in the back of the truck. And he went back there and he said, when was the last time you had communion? And they all looked at him and said, communion? And he said, yeah, when did you? They said, we've never had communion. And then, so he said, would you like it? And they all kind of said, well, sure, okay. And so he did a communion service for them. And he said they all took it. He didn't know if they were all Christian or not, but they all took communion. And they felt so good afterwards that the truck radioed down the line, and he wound up having to do communion at every truck in the line because they all wanted it. And he said it didn't matter to them what religion they were. They just wanted to have communion. And so he became known in his unit as the communion chaplain, and people would ask him for it when he would appear. And so we had a conversation about what was it about communion, even if you weren't Christian, that might have made a difference to people, that might have helped them a little, supported them. And I think one of those things is about how ritual puts you outside of ordinary time. It doesn't matter what the ritual is, that you know that you're in a different space and time than your ordinary work or your ordinary life. And that in a battlefield, in a zone where you're going to war, that moment outside of war, outside of being a soldier, where you can just be a human being and be affirmed as a human being, might have been part of why that ritual was so powerful for his unit. Because ritual does that. It says this is a different space, and in this space something is happening to you that's powerful and important. And for the Christians, of course, it would have perhaps reminded them of the divine love for them, or that no matter what happened to them, they were held in the love of God, which is kind of the way Herm, I'm sure, would have conveyed communion. But in any case, that I think that that was a good instinct he had. And I had a friend who was a college friend who enlisted in the Marine Corps and wound up in Vietnam as a company commander first, but originally a squad. And he said his unit got into a major firefight at one point, and he was the kind of lieutenant who got to know every person in his unit by name and knew something about their families and knew something deeply personal about each person in his unit. So he really cared about his men. And he said, so they got in a major firefight and he was on instinct giving orders that things were happening in a really chaotic situation. And he said out of the corner of his eye, he saw his corpsman run to a guy who had gotten a bad gut shot. And he just at that split second glance, he could tell the guy wasn't going to make it. He was going to die. And it was one of the kids in the unit he really, really liked a lot. And but that all happened in a split second, that thought, that awareness. And then he said he kept giving orders. And the next time he looked over there, he saw the corpsman holding this young man in his arms, and the corpsman was singing to the young man. And when he told that story, he wept. And I think it's because, again, it was this moment in this chaotic and horrible death-dealing situation where a person was held with a quality of humanity and as a dignity of a human being, to be seen into his death by somebody who cared enough to sing to him. And so that's another way in which these acts of ritual and kindness sort of create a cocoon, a place for a different reality for people when they're caught in chaotic conditions. And so Herm and I, he had lots of these stories, but we would talk about, well, how do you create a way for moral injury recovery that would do that, that would tell people you're not in your ordinary space, you have this space where you're being held as a human person, and that's where you begin the process of recovery. And so we worked on some things, and we tried to put together something we called like a 2-week boot camp out from research we'd done and experiences we had. And we tried to look at a model of recovery. This is a model that was created by a graduate student at the Harvard School of Public Health and the Divinity. He was taking 2 master's degrees at the same time, one in divinity, one in public health. And he was an intern for a conference we ran, and he created this model of what he called healing from moral injury. And I think it does capture a lot of the dimensions that are involved with moral injury, but it also gives you a sense of where you might come into a process of healing that could be useful without having to do everything. And so I think this is a helpful way to think about how to walk into the space of moral injury recovery and what we call soul repair. And we somewhere in that process with Herm, and it was after he retired, but we were still in conversation, that a person from Volunteers of America, the person who directed Veterans Affairs, who had worked at the Miami VA as director of mental health there, he joined Volunteers of America to be the director of Veterans Services. And he and the CEO of VOA came to visit us at the Soul Repair Center to learn about moral injury. And as soon as we started talking, they immediately got what it was, and they wanted to support the work we were doing and also teach their own veterans people more about moral injury. And so that partnership with Volunteers of America began even at the Soul Repair Center with Herm. And as we began to develop it, Volunteers of America wanted to try something with the veterans that we serve. And we have 31 state affiliates and serve about 30,000 veterans a year, mostly in transitional homeless housing, transitional housing, and low-income housing with wraparound services. So we began working on this project, and we were able to pull together, let me go back to this, pull together a team of 8 experts. So we pulled together, Jonathan Shay co-chaired the team of 8, along with Dr. Jim Monroe, who was Jonathan's working partner for 20 years at the Boston VA. So the two of them, a psychologist and a psychiatrist, co-chaired the team, and we brought in a Zen practitioner, Navy veteran Zen practitioner, to help us understand the use of mindfulness and spiritual practices. We had a person who was a Episcopal priest who had a PhD in ritual studies to help us think about the meanings and ways that ritual works, and how to create, how you can use a group to create their own rituals rather than imposing a sectarian ritual. We had a person who was a pastoral counselor and an expert in multicultural interfaith group facilitation, which seemed really important. We had a Marine Corps veteran who worked on moral injury for our Chicago affiliate, who had a little bit of experience of working with veterans with moral injury. And we had a pastoral counselor who's an expert on military sexual trauma. And we had the director of the chair of psychology and graduate and the dean for graduate studies and research at Texas Christian University, who was the head of our research design team. So he was the person in charge of doing the evidence-based research for any program that we were going to create. And he also taught moral psychology. So he was on the team to make sure that we were actually measuring what we were doing. In other words, that the research protocol fit the actual plan of the program and the goals of the program. So these 8 people, and then I was on as ex officio, these 8 people put together a thing that we called resilience strength training. And we chose that name because it didn't imply a pathology. It didn't name the problem, it named the solution, which is resilience. And when we talked to veterans, they said, well, yeah, veterans always like things that make them stronger and things that they're used to training, so they wouldn't be turned off. And so we used that term, and we avoided any suggestion that it was a mental health program. So there was never a mental health professional in the groups. We had a mental health professional back up the facilitators so that the facilitators did good self-care and didn't get into any kind of trouble personally, emotionally, because of things they heard. And we created it as a group model rather than as a one-on-one peer run model. And this is just a picture of a group of people from the program and some people who attended a seminar at a conference we had in Los Angeles in partnership with the Department of Mental Health of Los Angeles County. I could tell you amazing miracle stories about almost every person in this picture in terms of what working through their own moral injury did for their lives. But you know, we have most of the people in this picture went through the program and then trained to become facilitators in the program. And we have people who were in prison for over a decade who became facilitators. We have people who were about to lose their job because of their moral injuries who became facilitators, and mothers and fathers, and a whole different variety of various veterans who went through the program who became facilitators of the program because they got so much out of it, they wanted to give back. So we, as I said, it was a multifaceted program because moral injury is a complex thing. And I think the bad news is that moral injury is a really complex thing. And the good news is if you come in at all kinds of angles, you can make a difference. You don't have to do them all. If you do one thing that's helpful, it can mean a lot. So in our program, we used rituals, we used journal writing, we used art making, we used spiritual practices, and we oriented the end of the program toward returning to the world in service to others. So this is just an image of one of the group's masks. I'll explain in a minute, but we asked them early in the program to make a mask of their military face. And we got the idea from a therapist at Walter Reed who had been working with veterans with traumatic brain injury and PTSD, who couldn't necessarily speak about their experiences, but she knew they needed to express them. And so she had them make masks. And National Geographic did a whole issue with pictures of the masks that these veterans created. And it was really quite powerful. And we got similar powerful things out of them as they began to make their masks. And we created the entire process of a resilience strength training, or RST, as a ritual process. So we showed a film at the beginning that's 10 minutes that Bill Nash did for us about what moral injury is. And then we asked the group to lay down ground rules about confidentiality and how they would relate to each other. And then we asked them to give themselves a name so that it would be like a squad name. And so once they had done all of those preliminaries, then we had them bring childhood pictures or objects that were important to them to the ritual, to the process, to RST. And we created a table in the middle that would become, or this is a cloth on the ground, actually. Instead of a table, they had put a cloth down. And that would be in the center of the group the entire time it met, so that it would be like their group altar, like all things that are important to them would wind up on that altar. So their mask would go there. They did other things also, and those would wind up on the table. And we always had a bell to begin and end. And so we actually began by creating the ritual object in the middle that would mark that they were in ritual space. And then we would always begin with the bell and with mindfulness breathing every session. If they took a break, they came back to the bell and breathed again to start. And there was something about that structure, I think, that gave people a sense that what they were sharing and going through was being held with limits. So they weren't going to fall apart. There were other people there to hold them, and that it would at a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so one of the things that we focused on is lamentation. And as I said earlier today, sorrow and grief, I think, is a lot underneath the surface of moral injury because there's so much loss involved. And my friend Zachary Moon, who was a Navy Reserve chaplain and also a chaplain at the VA, now teaches pastoral theology at Chicago Theological Seminary. He says that sorrow is not really gendered as a masculine emotion. He said so often in men, and he experienced this as a chaplain, often in men, sorrow is expressed as anger. And so he said you have to pay attention to anger and not make people feel wrong for being angry, but you have to ask them what's going on with the anger, what's making them angry. And often he said you will discover that underneath that anger is either humiliation or grief. And so we actually had various times when people were given a chance to touch into that sorrow, partly through writing and partly through ritual. And I'll explain one of the rituals later that we used. We asked them to do a lot of writing. We gave them a journal, and we gave them a little kit of things when they arrived, including a mask blank, a journal, a writing instrument, and some art supplies and things. We asked them not to use electronic devices to do the writing, but to write by hand in the journal, because something happens differently in your brain when you're using your hand to write. And we did different kinds of writing. We had, sometimes they took it was like homework. They were to set their timer on their phone for 10 minutes and write for 10 minutes to a question. We called that free writing, where you write in a timed way and you don't lift your pen, you just keep writing. And even if you write the same word over and over, you do not stop writing. Because that process sometimes releases blockages in your brain, and you'll be surprised by the things you write. You weren't thinking you were going to write that, and suddenly you see it. So we used that kind of writing. We also had timed writing in the group. They just sat in the room. They could go to a table, but they sat in the room, and they were told that, you're going to write for 20 minutes, you're going to write for 10 minutes on this topic. Or we would take them through a guided meditation to take them back to an experience, to remember it, and then give them a chance to write what they came up with in the guided meditation. And we almost always used something like that before we asked them to share with the group. And that was partly to help them focus on the question in hand and to write on it, But it was also a way that they could control how much they self-disclosed. Because we knew that trust wasn't instant in a group, and so yeah, it sort of has to build. And it generally takes one or two of the more adventuresome people in the group to risk something pretty emotionally deep, and then the others will begin to go with them in that process. So the writing of things, writing of traumatic experiences, gave them a chance to decide how much they wanted to share. And if they weren't comfortable sharing really intimate things, they didn't have to. But asking them to write it gave them a way to remember what they had realized or felt in the writing. What we found was that in this process, the writing really more acted as a way to break a log jam that they would write, and then they would say way more in their sharing than anything they'd written down. So there was something about the writing that also freed them to be more self-disclosing and vulnerable with each other. So we used quite a lot of writing, and it was almost all of it was directed. We didn't just say write about something. We said, like, think about one of our early guided meditations that's deliberately focused on early life experiences. Ask them to imagine in their mind the first person they remember loving them, with the caveat that that person might also have betrayed or harmed them later, so that it didn't have to be perfect love. It was just their awareness of being loved. And then answer in the guided meditation to see that person, to see the gestures, the things they did that made them feel loved. And then when they came out of that guided meditation, we asked them to answer 3 questions and to keep writing on those 3 questions until the time was up. And the first question was, what did you receive from this person? The second question was, what did you give to this person? And the third question was, what problems did you cause this person? And the third question was crucial because it's about agency. And you can't recover from moral injury until you realize that you're an agent of your own life. Those 3 questions come from a Japanese practice that Buddhist psychotherapy uses to help people come to terms with difficult relationships in their early life. But we also found it useful for just helping people remember a different time in their life that had love in it, that is not their military experience, not their moral injury experience, but is the beginning of the process of their life, so that they can stretch their life out across time from that early period through the military to the present, to sort of relativize the moral injury experience as part of the flow of a narrative and not just the one thing in the room that's running everything. So we use writing to do that. We also used a lot of art things. We had lots of things on tables with art making opportunities, and any time they had free time, they could go to those tables and do things. A couple of our facilitators had groups that really liked music, so they had a regular evening time after the formal meeting where people could share a song from their playlist, and they would all like dance or do something with the music that each person selected. We had somebody else who played a guitar who brought it, and so the group started doing some singing together. With partly the arts, that kind of thing was based on what the group enjoyed doing together. And then of course they made those masks. And then the other art project, which when we decided to do it, I wasn't sure how it would work. It seemed a little weird to me, but it turned out to be quite useful, which is that we handed part of the kit they received at the beginning of the process was a packet of popsicle sticks, just a handful of popsicle sticks. And the popsicle sticks were for writing words on, and they had a little marker they could write words on their popsicle sticks. And so every time there was a sharing session or an activity and they were about to go to a break or a meal or in the day, we would ask them to take a minute and write on those popsicle sticks words that indicated insights they'd had or things they'd learned or things they wanted to give to other members of the group, like gratitude or courage or thank you or whatever. And so there would be this time at the end of every session where people would be doing their popsicle sticks and then passing them out to people. And we told the facilitators to make sure that if there was somebody who wasn't getting very many, that they gave that person some popsicle sticks, so that there was a circulating popsicle stick process. And so near the end of their time together, the last full day, we gave them an entire afternoon to take all those popsicle sticks and create their new moral group house. So they had to figure out what the house is going to look like and how the popsicle sticks were going to work and which ones went where in the house. And they got very creative about it. And they would have, you know, arguments about what went where, but that was part of the way they were struggling with how to build a new moral house with all the things that had happened to them in the group. And we had a beach cabana from one group. Another group built something that looked like a military fort. We had all kinds of different kinds of houses. One had a swimming pool. It was really pretty interesting. And in one case, we had a member of the group who was really timid and didn't even want to be there and didn't talk for the first day or two, he just blossomed the third day, and it turned out he was an engineer, and that group built the one house that was never going to fall down, because he just told everybody what the parts were and how to do the trusses and to make sure the roof was up. And so it was very interesting that they had an engineer in the group that could help them build the house. But they all loved the process. It turns out that they felt an ownership of the whole house as the group house. And in a couple of cases, we had groups where we had someone who was just too toxically angry to settle down enough to be in the group. And so we told them, well, this group is it working for you? We would like you to come back and try a different group, and we would ask them to leave. And those groups actually put the person who'd left in that moral house somewhere, in the doorway or outside the house, but with the group in the house in some form. And the first time a group did that, I said, and who's this here? And they said, well, that's for, you know, whoever who had to leave, because they were at the beginning. And so we think they're still part of our group. So I thought that was also an interesting phenomenon about how they use the art to express a sense of loss of that person, but also a sense that they still own that person as part of the group. And the other purpose of the art process, of course, is that when you're making something, when you're being creative, you're being an agent of the thing you're creating. And so it gives people a sense of their own agency to do creative things. And play also is that kind of thing. And so sometimes, as the group that did their playlist at night, they played, they danced, they just had a great time dancing. And sometimes they would watch a film or something late at night, but that was also part of the process. It happened especially with the groups we had at a retreat center for 5 solid days. But even the one that met once a week all day for 6 weeks also did some of these activities. And we actually used art with the group that met once a week. We actually created a group puzzle map, and each person got a piece of the puzzle. So when they returned to the group, they put their puzzle piece to make the puzzle complete while the group was meeting in the middle on the altar. And that was part of our way to help them feel a tug to come back, that the puzzle piece would be missing if they didn't come back. And here are just some of the masks that were made by a couple of, these are, I think, really quite fascinating, of their military face. This was, these were 2 that were made by a group of all women we had. We had one group of all men and one group of all women, and 9 groups that were mixed. They were all mixed with age and military branch and race and gender, except the all women and the all men's groups. So one of the rituals that we did near the end of the week was a ritual that this group that you see here actually invented and asked for. This was our first group, and they wanted to have the last night they were together, a chance to burn things they needed to let go of, that they were ready to let go of. And we had a lamentation ritual where they wrote a letter of unfinished business to someone that was haunting them, someone they needed to try to apologize to or say something to. And there was a lot of weeping around those letters. And often at the burn, at the last night, they would feel finished, and they would finished with that lamentation and finished with the unfinished business. And so then they would burn those things in the fire to say, I'm ready to move on. So this group asked for that. We didn't build it into the program, but we were also being responsive. And it worked so well, we started institutionalizing it as something every group did. But I will never forget the woman who, we weren't in the group, so this is what the facilitators reported to us. And we were at the burn, though. We weren't at the letters of lamentation and unfinished business, but at the burn, they invited us because they felt so good about what had happened to them. They wanted us to be at the burn. So I know that at the burn, the woman, a woman in the group read a letter she had written to her rapist. And she was ready to burn the letter. She said, I'm ready to burn it. She read the letter out loud, and then she said, I'm ready to burn this letter because I forgive you. And she burned that letter, which was very powerful. The whole group, wept. They were so happy for her. And so that we found that ritual, the ritual of a fire, that can consume what you no longer need to hold on to as suffering, was a really powerful thing that was near the end of the process for the groups. It was just really great. We also included in the program an hour of spiritual practice every day. We did different things based on what the facilitators were comfortable leading. And eventually we had the program administrators. We ran this in New York and Los Angeles, so I had a program administrator in each location, and they trained in a program called trauma release exercises, where you could guide people through a series of body exercises and then help them get in touch with stored trauma in their bodies. That's called TRE. That's not something a facilitator could learn to do, but we decided to have our administrators go through that, and so the group sometimes would want to do that exercise. We also discovered with the first group that a labyrinth walk is a very powerful spiritual exercise, and so we included at least 1 hour during that time together, one of those days, a labyrinth walk for every group that we had. Took us a while to figure out where to hold the meetings where we could get to labyrinths, but we found that was very powerful. And we always began each meeting session with mindful breathing, because it helps people calm down. And if they're going to share traumatic things, and they're in the habit of using mindful breathing all the time, that if a member of the group got very distraught and overwrought trying to share an experience that was really difficult, it was a very natural thing for a facilitator to ask the group to just all breathe together, so that the person who was also really upset, and generally the group was also empathizing with them, that everybody could return back to that place of listening, and calm down a little so that the person could keep sharing. And so we found that the spiritual practice of mindfulness breathing was a really powerful tool that the facilitators had for enabling people to share very deeply without losing the group emotionally and feeling embarrassed by being emotionally overexposed, which is a risk when you're asking people to share trauma. And I know those of you who are clinicians and therapists know that a lot of these things are used in therapeutic practices. And we just wanted our facilitators who were peers to be able to implement some of these so that it didn't suggest that they were experts taking care of other people, but they were peers leading them through a process that they understood it helped them. And then one of the last things we did besides helping people process their belief system, one of the writing exercises was to write for a half an hour the same sentence. I used to believe, but now I believe. And to write that over and over. I used to believe, and then now I believe. And to write for a half an hour as they begin to explore what is it now that they are committed to, what is the truth that guides their life now. And one of those that we encouraged, it wasn't a requirement, but we encouraged them to think about what are they going to do when they go home? How are they going to be different? How are they, what is one thing, that one action they're going to take? And beyond that, how will they find a purpose in their life that expands their life outward? So a lot of them wanted to become facilitators in the program as an act of service. Many of them had their first thing they were going to do is reconnect to their families. And others wanted to do more in their religious communities and went back to their churches, maybe wanting to start a veterans group in their churches. So we had just quite a lot of array of things that people wanted to do. I remember one of our participants was in one of our housing programs with veterans with children. And so she had gotten so much out of the mask making and the artwork that she decided that she would hold in their community room a once a week art program for children in that housing complex. And she did that for over a year. She ran an art program. Then she moved to Texas, so she couldn't do it anymore. But she was teaching the kids all kinds of arts and crafts, but asking them questions as they were, like a project to make an art object of something. And that I thought was a really creative way to be of service. But this is a picture of Team Rubicon. Some of you may, if you're a Marine, you might have heard of this. That Marine Corps veterans realized that as Marines, they were very competent at dealing with chaos and disaster situations. And that after having been serving in the Marine Corps, that they could turn those skills into saving lives by going to disaster areas. And they were often like first responders, like almost first boots on the ground in earthquakes and places, and hurricanes and things like that. And so this another case, Eric Hodges, who's a professor of veteran studies, did his doctoral thesis on this urge that's so deep in so many military veterans to do something service oriented, and to be involved in service work, or to run for office, or to serve their communities in some kind of way. This is deep in military culture and the ethos of military service. And it's a good thing. It's a good thing that comes out of people who've been in the military, that they see personal success is not lacking ambition, that you want your life to mean more than your own personal success. So this is a picture of one of our groups. This was the all men's group, the first group we ran in New York. And the woman in the, this woman here, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but the woman in the gray hoodie, and the guy in the light blue shirt in the back row with the bandana around his head, were the facilitators, Titus and Corinne. And Corinne was the only female in the group. So when they role played difficult situations, she got to be everybody's mother, to play everybody's mother. And so they started calling her mom in the group, even though she wasn't old enough to be their mother. This is a group where Titus in the light blue shirt, the facilitator, had put a bullet in his own heart. And he told me that he shot the gun. It was a friend of his who was a policeman. It was a service revolver of his friend who was showing him the service revolver. And he was no longer in the military, and he saw the gun, and he realized it was his chance to kill himself. And then he said, I thought if I I tried to shoot myself in the head, I might miss, and then I'd be like brain dead but alive, and that would be awful, he said. So I was pretty sure if I pointed the gun at my heart, I would definitely die. And instead, it ricocheted around his insides, and they had to do a lot of surgery, but they were able to save him. So he told a suicide attempt story in the group, and 5 others told their story. So at this graduation that I attended, I was able to see this. He stood in front of the group and raised his right hand and said, "I'm going to take a pledge today that I will not die by my own hand. And I'm inviting anybody who wants to join me in that pledge." So 5 hands went up. So that was part of they get a certificate when they go through the program. That was part of their graduation ceremony. And then we had in this group 2 Vietnam era veterans over on the left side of the picture, Rick, who was 77, and Ramon, who was slightly younger. And they were friends in a transitional housing program that the OA ran in New York. So they had been homeless. And Rick, it turned out, had a veteran girlfriend that when he left the program, 6 months after he left the program, he married her and was very happy. And Ramon, in the camel sleeves, he'd had a very cruel father. And so he was estranged from his natal family. He just wasn't in touch with his family at all. So the first thing he did when he left was make contact with his nephew, whom he still sees his nephew weekly. And he stays in touch with his nephew that he'd always loved, but he wasn't in touch with until he went through this program. And then he felt worthy to contact that nephew. He also decided that he would volunteer to go to the senior center near where his transitional housing program was, because there were veterans in this senior center that didn't have any visitors, and there were other older people that didn't have visitors. And so he made it his service project to go every week and just sit and talk to people who didn't have visitors. Then he started playing chess in the park with the old men in the park that played chess. And so he just sort of became a senior minister to seniors in his own way, and enjoyed it a lot. And so those are the kinds of things that some of the people in the program wound up doing to be of service to others. And they were very interesting, their choices. And this is just some preliminary research. We did publish at the end of last year in December in the journal Veteran Studies. You can look it up. An essay called "Effects of Resilience Strength Training on Moral Injury in Veterans." And what we found, we did a baseline when they took a survey when they walked into the program. They took the same survey at the end of their time together before they left the program. And then they were asked to take the same survey 6 months later. And of course, we had a fall off in the numbers who took the 6-month survey, but we had enough to make a valid study. And what we found was that their self-esteem grew, and it did not go back to none of the scores went back to baseline. So all of the scores had improvement from baseline to session 1. And of course, it was quite dramatic in some cases. And then in session 2, after 6 months, things tended to level off, so they stayed the same or declined slightly, but some kept going up. So the self-esteem one was surprising; it kept going up. So that was heartening. And we don't know what more religious involvement means, whether they were meditating a lot or whether they were actually back in religious groups. We're not sure what the specifics of religious involvement are, but that also was good. And then their optimism was important. Their sense of that life is worth living also was improved from baseline. The one surprising thing that we discovered, because we had a measure about it, but we weren't actually looking at that, this other result, was sleep improvement. And of course, sleep is the key to everything. Sleep is the key to mental health, physical health, all kinds of well-being is involved with sleep and quality sleep. And what we discovered was that they were sleeping about 6 hours a night when they came, and they were sleeping maybe 6.5 hours. So the length of time sleeping wasn't such a key thing. But what we discovered was that the quality of their sleep was much higher. So I had a couple of veterans say, "Oh yeah, man, when I got there, it was so peaceful and quiet. I stopped using my sleeping pills." And a lot of them reported that they had stopped using sleep aids and they were sleeping better. They weren't getting up during the night. So the quality of their sleep went up in this program, which isn't even a thing we were trying to do. It just seemed to have happened. Um, so I just want to say a little bit, and then I'm going to open it up for questions about how we're seeing an awful lot of moral distress, and I think we're going to see a lot more moral injury during the pandemic, not just in the civilian population, but also in the ways that veterans have been isolated and not been able to get the kinds of services that they were before the pandemic because of social isolation, not being able to see family members, not being able to do a lot of the things that help keep them from sinking into depression and other things. And so that, it's the times are chaotic, they're uncertain, they're worrisome, and there are also leadership failures. A sense of betrayal, I think, is serious, especially in healthcare, when there wasn't enough PPE, and sometimes hospital administrators weren't sensitive to how much their own staff were suffering and were way too bureaucratic. And the pandemic created high risk for negative consequences, very high stakes. And so many people were working exhausted or discouraged. Of course, in healthcare, the risks are so high that if you don't do your job well, people could die. And the pandemic made doing a good job virtually impossible for every patient. Doctors were having to triage patients, which is not something a civilian doctor usually expects to have to do and may not even ever have had done before. So the other is that people's capacities for empathy were depleted, and that's such an important thing, especially in nurses and doctors have empathy for their patients. We started talking about moral distress in medicine. There is no way in the middle of a pandemic that we could possibly have created even a 20-hour program to help people process moral injury. That is something that's going to have to come when they have time. But we were trying to figure out what could we do as Volunteers of America to try to alleviate some of the moral distress that people are carrying, because there was a lot of it. Somebody asked me, well, what's the difference between burnout, exhaustion, and moral distress? And I think one way you could distinguish among some of these things is that if you're just working too hard and you're exhausted and you're just blindly fatigued, then getting enough sleep or going on a vacation can refresh you so that you feel energized and ready to come back to work. Moral distress can't be fixed with sleep or a vacation. It's going to haunt you. It's going to stay with you. It's going to plague you until you actually deal with it and process it. And rest can help so that you're less stressed in general. But moral distress has to be processed, just like moral injury. It has to be processed, or it will just fester and take you down. So we actually created an online 1-hour thing called Resilient Strength Time. That's online. The veterans that came out of our program already knew how to do a lot of the skill sets that we used. We drew from that veterans program things we knew worked, like mindfulness breathing, teaching people to listen without commenting, and using guided meditation to help people share. So we managed to compress a few of those things into a 1-hour group time. And it meets multiple times a week. And we started with our own healthcare workers and our own staff, and then we just sort of opened it out to anybody who wanted to come in there. And we're now in the process of working with a couple of healthcare companies to set it up for their graduate nurse programs, to get the nurses in the habit of discharging their moral distress with other people on a regular basis. so that's an ongoing program we've created, and now we realize that, okay, some of the things we've used in RST for our veterans is actually helpful in this program. They seem to help. The evaluations are good. So we're now going to try to turn that veterans program into an online program as well, into this longer program, and test it with veterans to see if it works. And if it does, we're going to adapt it for healthcare, because I think the society is going to see a major crisis, a pandemic of moral injury coming soon. As soon as everybody's vaccinated enough that medical caregivers can get a chance to sit and reflect about what they've been through. And then I think they're going to realize moral injury. So I'm going to stop there. So there's a little time for conversation and discussion. This is just a bibliography of some of the things I've mentioned in my 2 talks that you might find helpful. And if you go to voa.org/moral injury, you will find a resources page that's a very thorough set of bibliographies for very different populations. We're trying to keep that updated every week with new stuff that gets, there's a lot now published on moral injury. So much that we actually had to articulate our resources page into for veterans, for clergy, for the general public, so that people can find information. So I'm gonna stop my share. I'll just leave you with, I think I have this last, yes, I wanna leave you with this insight about moral injury. Moral injury is a lifelong process. Once you are changed by an event as catastrophic as something that would cause you to be morally injured, it's not something you're ever going to forget, but you're going to be processing it. And every time you process it, you will draw a new insight or a new revelation from that process. So you don't have to treat it as your enemy. It can be a gift, a difficult gift, but a gift.
Well, thank you, Dr. Brock. Again, there's quite a lot to think about in terms of what the recovery process might look like. And I think you brought up, we're starting to see some questions pop up here.
Good.
I think one of the things that really came out in terms of how you do therapy for moral injury would be to contrast it with how we've been doing therapy for post-traumatic stress. And there seem to be some elements in common, in the sense that storytelling is a big part of this, with prolonged exposure, though I think the objective is a little bit different than it is here.
Yeah.
So could you maybe say a little bit about what you see as being different focus for moral injury therapy versus PTSD?
Yeah. Bill Nash actually talked about this in a lecture he gave at the American Academy of Religion. What he said was that there's some treatments for PTSD that can actually make moral injury worse. And exposure therapy is one of those that might do that. Because with PTSD, there's often holes in memory and people don't have a coherent narrative. They have flashbacks, or they have episodes of pieces of things they can see or smell, and they re-experience rather than remember. And that's a big difference. So you need to have them stop re-experiencing and putting those things into a memory narrative, so they have a story, a full memory. And he said, so if you keep bringing people back to these flashbacks to try to put them into a coherent system, he said, if you already have moral injury, it can be agonizing to have to revisit the same painful memory over and over again. And so you have to be attentive to, is this an episode that might be morally injurious, and find a way to draw them out on the moral injury exposure as you're helping them remember, because otherwise you could sort of put somebody into pretty deep moral injury hole and not realize they're going there. And so that's one case where repeated storytelling might not be helpful to somebody with moral injury, especially if they finally come out with a memory and then it makes them feel worse about themselves, because they remember that they actually did something that they've forgotten, that they didn't have an awareness of, and then they can feel even worse. So So the moral dimensions of trauma need to be attended to, I think, anytime you're dealing with someone who's traumatized. So yes, there are some, and I don't know any others, and I'm not a clinician myself, but I remember that one from Bill Nash because it made so much sense once he explained it. Why you wouldn't want to just help somebody retrieve a memory without attending to the moral implications of that memory.
Thank you. There are some other questions that seem to be looking at past, prior to military experience and what it might lead to, and then whether that comes out in the therapy as well, which certainly it could.
Yeah.
But the first one is very specific, and you may, if you're aware of any indications that early traumatic experience might be connected to things like war atrocities. In this particular case, he's mentioning those that are led by commanders in the field. So I guess that could touch on the dimension of the commander or the followers.
Yeah. Well, I think if you grew up in a family environment where you were violated or you couldn't trust your parents, I think being betrayed by a commander could either fulfill a script that's like your life script that you can't trust anybody, or it could in some other way resonate with that earlier trauma of betrayal, and that may be why betrayal is so tightly associated with post-traumatic stress disorder as well. But this is the interesting thing, we had participants in our veterans program who said their military experience wasn't the bad trauma that really had affected their life. That they actually went into the military because it gave them a stable life. And there were costs to that, but for them, the costs of being in the military were worth it compared to what they had in their family. And so it isn't always necessarily that the military aggravates or builds on life trauma. It can actually stabilize people and give them a chance to grow up. I actually had a friend who entered a convent for the same reason. She said her family was so unstable that she became a nun for a period of time. And she said, it gave me a chance to grow up. And then once I was stabilized, I realized I didn't want to stay a nun. And she later married and all of that. But so sometimes an institution that feeds you, houses you, and gives you friends, because the military does do that, that can be a positive thing compared to what you had to do. Like Titus, the person who shot himself in the heart, he had an adoptive mother who was kind of a torturer. It was horrible. And so he was homeless. At 14, he'd run away and he was on the streets. And so when he enlisted, when he was old enough to enlist, he managed to finish school. He's very smart. He actually managed to finish school while homeless. He enlisted in the military because it gave him a home, basically. And for him, it wasn't a military trauma that was why he tried to kill himself. It had to do with being sexually abused by a priest. So it's complicated why people suffer. And the military isn't, I don't want to suggest that military moral injury is, it only happens because people go in the military. Because we had the Marine Corps veteran I know that's working on boot camp out for the US military himself had a very traumatic childhood in which his parents divorced, and then when he was 5 or 6, his mother tried to stab him. She said, "You're just like your father." And so his grandparent, his foster care, he was given to his grandparents who couldn't deal with his anger, and so he wound up in military school. So he grew up in military school, and so the Marine Corps was a natural thing for him to go into. It was sort of a continuation of his childhood. And his cousin was in that same military school, and his unit, he became a special ops squad leader. His entire unit were all from that military experience. So his family just sort of went with him into the military. It wasn't until he got in he said his unit had 127 7 successful missions, which is a lot. And then they got sent on a secret mission that was actually vaguely illegal. They didn't know that, but they got sent on a vaguely illegal mission where an explosion killed his entire unit except himself. And his cousin was really badly injured and asked Ron to kill him because he knew he was going to die. And so Ron did that. He killed his own cousin as a kind of mercy killing. But that was his moral injury. It wasn't the 127 missions. It was that his whole family, he lost his whole family as a squad commander. Anyway, I'm not telling a secret. He actually talks about his life in podcasts and in a TED Talk. He actually tried to hang himself in San Quentin prison. And when he didn't succeed, he realized he had to figure out why he was still alive. So you never know what it's going to be. You know, that's why every person has to sort all this out and tell their own story. You just never know what is going to be the thing that drives the moral injury. But there's, yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was to say, being in a space where you can tell that kind of story is not something you find most places, and so the discussion that you some of the examples you presented really show ways to bring liminal space together. And one of our questions has come in: is there an equivalent to this type of an experience outside of the military in the trauma care community? And the specific example that was this is JT brought up would be the EST, or the landmark training forums, which are a little bigger format, but they also go into kind of pushing boundaries and things like that. I'm not sure if you're familiar with those particular types of forums, but maybe there are others that you are familiar with.
Yeah, well, years ago, I wrote a book on prostitution in Asia and the United States because I'm a feminist, and Asian women were worried, and there are all these U.S. military bases. And in that process, I discovered that the creation of brothels and the sex trade in Japan began with the construction of Buddhist monasteries. And that there are all these there are these Buddhist stories about the novice monks that go over the wall and go visit women, and they sort of have to get over that. But it was also true that during the imperial period in Japan, the monasteries had soldier monks that were so powerful that the emperor actually had to ask permission to be able to enter the grounds of the monastery. So it was quite clear that the kinds of monastic training that some religious sects use is very much akin to the same kind of things that the military uses. And these are very effective training methods to train discipline, strength, personal control, group bonds, all of those sorts of things. So the military isn't the only institution that uses these kinds of methods. And I think it's sort of simplistic to call it brainwashing. It is not brainwashing, but it is intense, fierce training, and with a lot of emotional pressure to perform. And I think there are paramilitary institutions that also do it, maybe not as fiercely as the military, but I think law enforcement officers go through similar kinds of training. I think medical training can be like that. It can be quite, they deprive you of sleep and make you function for hours to do things, because sometimes you might be in that situation, you have to be able to do it. And there's a lot of, there's so much you have to learn, and you have to, and when you think about how surgery works, it's like it's like the book of Leviticus stuff on ritual is nothing compared to what a surgeon has to do to walk into an operating theater and cut somebody open. So all this the washing, all the special clothing and the sanitation of the space, and then the team, and it's in a highly elaborate ritualized training process that has to be done exactly so. So there's lots of this kind of stuff in the society. We just don't think of it like we think about the military, because what they do is often life-saving rather than facing down enemies and having to kill people. Because of course, surgeons actually cut people open, and if you did that as a private citizen, you would go to prison for murder or something, or for a physical assault. And so what one does is not so much the issue, it is the context and the moral codes under which one does things. So anything that powerful has to be ritualized. It has to be ritualized.
And that there's another couple of questions that are coming up around the notion of religion and spirituality, in the sense that one would assume that with this type of these types of practices, that communities of faith that have rituals and that have other things that are that are imbued with meaning in that way would be inherently good places to do this kind of healing work. And then the other one is, does the religion and spirituality come up in the groups that you've worked with? I know you're working in that kind of a context, but
Yeah.
Is there some tension there around those two things?
By the time we get to the explicit religious things, they're generally so happy to be with each other that when they disagree about it, it doesn't turn into rancorous arguments about religion. Because we've had groups, where there was an atheist and an evangelical Christian and everything in between, and then somebody Jewish or Muslim. We've had Muslims, we've had lots of different kinds of religious traditions. But I think that the fact that they share a military culture binds them. That's a place to begin with a shared culture, and they trust that culture because they believe that if they share something like killing your own cousin, people are not going to judge you because they share that culture and they understand that sometimes you're put in those kind of positions, or sometimes you're so angry you go and you kill somebody and you didn't, it wasn't lawful, but you did it. They don't, there's a way they don't judge each other so they can process those kinds of things. It's if you start to wade into the moral injury space, you just have to prepare yourself to hear things and not judge them, not to react with disgust or horror, or you just stay with how that person is feeling about it. You just stay with them in an empathetic way. And we have rules about don't pass somebody a Kleenex. If they ask for one, give them one, but don't pass somebody a Kleenex. It's sort of like saying, take care of your problem, would you? I don't want to see those tears. We have, things about not offering too much comfort until they're ready. And we encourage time of silence after a person speaks something really emotionally powerful. We ask people to breathe. It's inappropriate to say anything because what's been said has been said. Take the feeling in. Let the person sort of take in what they just said. Often people don't even hear themselves until they speak, and then they realize in the silence what they actually said. And so there's that kind of receptive deep listening is something we train them to on the first day. We do it, we practice it, because there's something miraculous about that kind of listening, of being heard at that level, having your feelings validated. We tell them it's not your job to figure out what's true and not true. The feelings will be true. If they're feeling it, they're feeling it. Whether it's something really happened or not is sort of not the point. It's not a trial. And with the religious stuff, it comes out in that way. It comes out in people expressing their sense of their religiosity in the telling of the stories they tell. And it's their story. There's no arguing with that. And we have one of our facilitators is a deeply religious, born again Christian, who was raised in a Orthodox Ukrainian Jewish family. So he's kind of an interesting cultural hybrid. And we just said, if you want to do something at the end that's a prayer, just make sure it's not sectarian, because you're going to make people feel left out. And he gets that. He gets that. And he's actually very good at generic prayers when he does them. But that's something we stress with the facilitators. It's like, it's not your faith that matters, it's the person you're talking to. So it's a kind of way a chaplain has to relate to somebody, is that whatever I happen to believe isn't the point. It's who the person I'm talking to and what they're struggling with, that's the point. And it's not my job to give them something or to tell them something. It's to draw them out and help them process it. There's a film, Almost Sunrise, about two veterans who walk from Wisconsin to Los Angeles to process their moral injury. And it's the first film that explicitly says what moral injury is and identifies that as the struggle these two veterans are having. And at the end of their walk, they stay with people and talk about moral injury and all those sorts of things. And they get to Santa Monica, and one of them feels pretty good and he goes home. He feels like he's resolved a lot of things, but the other one feels uncertain still. He's not quite all there. And so he winds up going to a yoga retreat, I think in Colorado. And he comes out of that having finally resolved and what was bothering him, and talking to a priest, and he goes home. But the film is a little vague about that. And so I asked him, I know the people involved in the film, and I asked him and I said, what happened in that yoga retreat? How come it's not in the film? And he said, well, people didn't want the yoga retreat film. So he said, so we couldn't talk about what happened in the yoga retreat. He said, but something happened to me as I was doing this power yoga breathing and stuff. He said, I suddenly realized I was furious with God. He said, I'm not religious. It was a surprise to him. He didn't actually know that was in him. But he said, I realized I was just furious with God because my best friend died next to me in Iraq. And I believe that God let that happen, and I was furious with God. And so when he left the yoga retreat, he went and talked to a Catholic priest because he'd been raised Catholic, but he was not churched anymore. And the priest led him through a forgiveness ritual so he could forgive God. And that's what made him feel fine. And then he went home. So you never know. This is a person who didn't think he was religious. So you never know what will come out. But for somebody to have told him you're angry at God probably wouldn't have worked. He actually had to realize it himself. Because it's what's inside you that's plaguing you, not what somebody else knows. I think that's hard if you have an evangelizing attitude about your faith and you're pretty sure it's a good answer for other people, to withhold that until they might ask, but to offer it too soon often will silence what's happening inside somebody. So that's why the silence is so good. The silence lets things kind of, and the write your own things that helps things perk up. Make a mask. It comes from inside you and is externalized. And the masks are fun. Once they make their mask, they all look at their mask, they comment on it. Oh, what is this? What is that? So they also interact with each other around what they see. And often, we've had groups that were close enough in their faith affiliation that they were comfortable praying at meals, but we don't actually do that as a regular thing. The group, it's sort of, we let the group decide.
Yeah, I think that you're talking about moving some of the individual things not only into the external world, but also into the collective level of experience, which again, we don't have a lot of places that we can do that in most of our institutions. So I'm thinking one of our questions was, what else can we do to help equip our institutions to do a better job, maybe not just for veterans, but for helping us to heal moral injuries, particularly in a time in this country where we're struggling with race, with gender, with the policing function, and there's a lot of things that are not coming forward or not able to come forward.
Yeah, yeah. We're actually right now at VOA working on about an 8-hour curriculum that would be moral injury informed ministry, and so we're hoping to be able to start groups at the end of June. We're working on the curriculum for it, but we want to help chaplains and religious leaders and congregational leadership like deacons and elders and people like that who have a leadership role in their communities to learn how to do moral injury work in their contexts, because the epidemic is coming. And I think one of the fastest ways to deal with it is to get with the spiritual caregivers. And so if you go to voa.org/moral injury, you can sign up for the newsletter of the Shay Center, and we will announce this curriculum coming up. And we think we're gonna do it by actually processing people through the moral injury process itself. To begin with an experience of what it's like to be in a group processing moral injury is the best way to figure out what the definitions apply to and what the strategies mean if you've actually been through it yourself. And so we're looking at trying to do a compressed, maybe 3-hour processing, and then another 3 hours of information, resources, strategies that you could do in groups or with individuals. So that people are better equipped in their own ministry work to address what will be a massive form of cultural suffering. I think it's going to be a lot of people, and not just frontline workers. I mean, I have younger friends with kids at home who are really struggling with trying to take care of their children and also work. It's been a real struggle, and they even feel sort of guilty about not doing it right, not being able, they just said we're so exhausted they gave up on some of the school lessons and things like that. It's just been a lot that people have been carrying. I don't know if it's a kind of moral injury that they're going to kill themselves over, but they're bothered. And it's keeping them up at night, and they worry about things. And so we need to help people restore their equilibrium, because there's a lot of work to be done to rebuild the society. The healthcare system is going to be decimated as well. Before COVID hit, 48% of nurses were considering leaving their profession. It's now in the 76% range. Doctors also, the last thing I read was that doctors are one of the professions with the highest suicide rates. And so healthcare, if we want healthcare for the country, we're going to have to figure out how to deal with the aftermath of this pandemic, and help people stay. We need to save as many of the healthcare workers as we can.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And the return of Brent Holmes signifies that we have again run out of time.
My last word about this is, people with moral injury are the moral people. They're the good people. They're the people we really want to help. Helping people come back from moral injury brings you a resilient, good, strong person. It's been my experience with veterans. I just love them. They're just, when they process all this, they're just so excited not to be suffering and so excited to do things and help, and it's great.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you again, Dr. Brock and Dr. Buechner, for another great discussion focusing on moral injury. Dr. Brock, thank you for sharing your research and your experience in this important topic. We're going to take a 10-minute break before starting the breakout sessions for the afternoon. Again, the link to the breakout sessions can be found on the confirmation email that you received this morning. If you have any difficulties finding that link or getting logged in, please call the Hounstein Center office at 616-331-2770. A survey will automatically pop up in your browser. Please take a moment to provide feedback for the afternoon general session. For those that are attending for CEUs, this survey is required. At the end of the afternoon breakouts, we will come back together for a brief final remark. Again, Dr. Brock, it's been a joy to have you, and we really appreciate the time that you spent with us. Please enjoy the afternoon breakout sessions.